everybody, welcome to Wet Blanket, home of bad audio and even worse takes, and today I have here friend of the channel and personal Instagram mutual, Third Memeanese School. They are not only a stellar meme page on Instagram that you should give a follow, but they are also a musicologist. So I decided, I've been having a lot of different music history videos on my channel lately, and I thought that it would be fun to bring somebody in that actually kind of knows what they're talking about for once. Today we are, if you had watched my video, This Isn't the End, I talked about a lot of 20th century composers and kind of how their lives mirror ours right now, but the one genre, I guess, of composers I didn't really touch on in that video all that much were the French 20th century composers. I had only mentioned Poulenc close to the end. Also, as a musicologist, do you pronounce it Poulenc or Poulenc?
Initially this is actually kind of complicated because initially I thought that it was Poulenc, and I speak French, not like a native speaker. But then one of my professors, she's from France, like an actual real life French person. And she was like, no, we would say it's Poulenc. I've heard it both ways from real French people. France is a real place.
Ain't no way. I remember being in vocal lit class and my vocal lit professor was like, yeah, anybody who, actually studies French diction would be inclined to say Poulenc. But he insisted it was pronounced Poulenc, and I was like, whatever. Regardless, that is not who we're talking about today. We are talking about one of his very early mentors, the elusive Eric Satie, who is just a character in music history. Despite being so strange, he has kind of been regarded as an NPC or side character in his own life.
Yeah.
So I have, again, Third Memeanese here because their forte is 20th century French music, specifically Poulenc, but also that would include his teacher, and that would include Cocteau, that would include all of those guys that I've been too afraid to touch, which is why I have you here with me now. I've yapped enough. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, I'm Third Memeanese School, and I make silly pictures for the internet. A lot of my previous research, on this subject matter, has been primarily on Francis Poulenc or Poulenc, whichever way you really prefer to say it. It's primarily on the early 20th century Avant-Garde in both visual arts and in music, because I studied art also for 6 years before I went into musicology as well. So it's mostly this time period in France, Dada Surrealism, around World War I and between World War II as well. My most recent research I have done is on Jean Cocteau and Francis Poulenc, the way that they sort of appropriated semantic and decontextualization, and rather than doing that with visual signifiers, they're doing it with musical signifiers as a sort of auditory photo montage. And so unlike Schoenberg, who changed the way that music sounds, they were really just trying to change the way that music means without changing the way that we typically conceive of the way music sounds.
So, as you kind of had mentioned, my personal bread and butter is the Second Viennese School in Germany, and they did really go at it two very different ways. While the Germans decided to use math and decided to kind of weaponize sound for better or for worse, the French just tried to change the way that we feel about it. Is that a correct assessment? Without necessarily changing the way that we create it?
Sort of. It's a lot more subtle. And I think part of the reason why they're often overlooked is because exactly how subversive they're using particular cliches and tropes within their music. So I think one of my favorite examples from my most recent research is Le Marié sur le Tour Eiffel. It's a I don't even know what to call it. It's not a ballet. It's not a play. It's like a genre-defying production that Toaded with Lacey's. It literally...
Very them.
Yeah. Some of the reviews of this were like, what the fuck is it? What do we call this thing? Am I allowed to swear on your channel?
Yes, you're allowed to swear.
Do you watch Trailer Park Boys?
Yes, actually, I actually do.
Oh my god. I'm so much like Ricky. I'm like, if I can't smoke and swear, I'm absolutely fucked. Like,
that's very French of you to say.
Listen to, Parade. We'll talk about Parade. I'm thinking of, the dance of the little American girl, where, Satie incorporates, all of these musical signifiers of, Americanness to, indicate that she is an American.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's, the way that they incorporate these, signs. It's semantics. It's semiotics.
Kind of reminds me of and I guess we'll talk about this a little bit later. When I was doing my own research on Satie, and you can clock me on this if I'm wrong, he was almost a precursor to Impressionism because of the way he tried to, I guess, evoke the feeling of something without actually evoking the something.
He kind of operates as an NPC within his own life, and someone's gonna yell at me for this. I might be wrong. I'm totally open to being wrong, but the previous research that I've done on Parade, even though Satie has written, the score, and he was really involved in the project, it feels like he was just kind of there.
No, I'll defend you on that. I feel the exact same way. I'm personal friends with somebody who wrote a 15-page paper on Eric Satie, and still at the end of the day, the only things that kind of come up as landmarks about who he was had less to do with his actual music and more to do about the person that he tried to portray himself to be, whether that person was supposed to be a caricature of himself or whether that who he actually was. He's kind of a man that's more made up of how he interacted with others and less made up of, actual substance.
The thing about Satie is that you're right. It seems like he is mostly defined based off of the people that he interacts with rather than, the people that, or, the person that he actually is. And I feel like he has this quality about him that's really easy to project onto.
His demeanor and his, I guess, outlook, and the way that he portrayed himself was very infectious. There are scholars that, and again, you can clock me on this, you're the Lacey scholar, but I've heard in the past that they would refer to him as kind of the funny uncle of their group or whatever they were. He started out in, is it pronounced Honfleur?
The town that he lived in?
Yeah.
Hold on. Let me read it off the page. Let me Google Eric Satie.
ChatGPT is doing our video.
I'm on the Eric Satie Wikipedia page.
God damn it.
Yeah, it's on Flo.
His family started out there, but then his younger brother, and his mother and father moved to Paris for a time. His mother died, and his father shipped him and his brother back to Honfleur, and he stayed in Paris. And then Eric and his brother were raised by his grandparents, and I love how you put in the notes, don't leave out Seabird. That was actually in my fun facts at the bottom of the page.
It stressed me out when you were talking about his family and you didn't mention Seabird. I literally just learned about him earlier this week. I was like, he makes so much sense in the context.
Right? Trust me, I'm not engaging in Seabird erasure here. He was raised by his grandparents, but also living in Honfleur was his uncle Seabird, who was called Seabird because he had this gorgeous, lavish, decked-out boat that he would sit in that never left the dock. So he would just kind of sit in the boat and, I guess, just fuck around, still tied to land the entire time. But it was these people, his grandparents and his Uncle Seabird, that really brought to him his earliest musical inspiration. and that was because his grandparents raised him as a very strict Roman Catholic, and so he had a lot of early influence from Gregorian chant, but also Seabird would often take him to the circus, and so he would also have a lot of influence from circus music, which, I mean, contextualizing that in terms of what his musical style turned out to be, I feel like the mixture of Gregorian chant and circus music really makes sense.
I was thinking about this earlier insofar as, like, the influences on, well, I would say, like, Poulenc in particular, because Les Six was only connected insofar as they had a name. There was nothing else really connecting them. They had no real aesthetic unity. And so, but, like, Poulenc kind of followed a similar trajectory because his own father was really strict Roman Catholic. And then he left, like, or his father died and he wasn't really religious anymore. And so a lot of Poulenc's earlier music as well is influenced by the circus. And he was, like, at the premiere of Parade, which he cited as being, like, one of the, like, musical, like, moments that really defined his trajectory. And in addition to the fact that, like, Les Six, like, when they were hanging out, they would, like, go to, like, I forget what it was called, but there was, like, these carnivals, and they would all, like, go together to these carnivals as well. So it just seems like, I don't know, the parallels are really interesting, and I'm sure that some of it came about because of that influence from Satie, especially in his earlier career. It's, like, kind of weird how that happened. Satie was just well, I shouldn't say just, but he seemed to be useful to the younger avant-gardists, like Cocteau. Have you read The Cock and the Harlequin?
No, I have not.
I don't want to assume. Like,
no, that's okay.
So I recommend you and everybody else listening to go read The Cock and the Harlequin. It's Jean Cocteau's musical manifesto, and he wrote it in 1918. And so, I mean, it's really just a load of bullshit. He wrote it specifically to piss people off. Within this manifesto, and actually, I don't even think he fully believed what he was saying. Maybe partially, but anyway, he is basically, the gist is, he's denouncing German music and puts Satie in the position of, like, the aesthetic figurehead for this, like, new French movement that he's trying to create. After Parade, people sort of, like, or I shouldn't say people, like, people within this art space, the avant-garde art space, sort of, like, saw the opportunity to, or, like, French artists, I mean, saw the opportunity to sort of take the spotlight away from Germany, which is fundamentally unserious art, a really fundamentally anti-bourgeois art movement, too. And that was a lot.
Oh, yeah. that does tie us perfectly back into Satie, because, in a way, he kind of became, through Cocteau and through the relationships he kind of became a figurehead for something that initially he didn't really even intend on being a part of, or, you know, he didn't realize that the stuff that he did was going to be as influential as it was. So, I mean, he again had early inspiration from Gregorian chant and circus music, but he was also somebody who in his youth was regarded as quite unremarkable. Again, much like Poulenc, was kind of chronically slept on in his youth. Not in the same way Poulenc was, though. I mean, he was taking a piano prep class for the Paris Conservatory. So think, like, you know, entry-level piano lessons for 7 years, and every single year was being rejected for the Paris Conservatory intermediate courses until he finally passed the test. And when he entered the Paris Conservatory, he only lasted for 2 years because he didn't realize that music school was going to be as hard of work as it was, and all of his professors thought he had great talent, but ultimately they saw Satie as lazy. So he dropped out of school and joined the army. And the funniest part of it is, like, he joined the army on his own volition because under French law, that makes your mandatory service cut down from 5 years to, I think it was 1 year, yes. But he got out of military service after less than 1 year due to self-inflicted bronchitis. I don't know how the hell you give yourself bronchitis, but he did that and then was discharged from the military. So this is somebody who's like, you look at it at face value and you're like, this guy's a fucking case, you know. He's a piece of work, you know. He has no drive, he has no you know, he's got no direction, but ultimately because of who he was around, he fell into this space of influential work.
I was reading The Banquet Years by Roger Shattuck.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was like, I didn't know any of this about Satie. He's kind of like a really enigmatic figure, and I think that's where a lot of the fascination comes from, with sort of, I wouldn't say like a revival per se, but like the fascination of his weird pieces, like the furniture music and that kind of stuff. And I didn't necessarily expect, like, I actually didn't know what to expect.
Right?
But I also didn't, yeah, I was like, I feel like I've like met people like Satie before, like high school dropouts that have like no real ambition for anything or don't really want anything in particular.
He was kind of the SoundCloud rapper of his time.
Do you think that if Satie was alive today, he would be a SoundCloud rapper?
Dude, hell yeah. After giving himself bronchitis, he moved to a more bohemian area in Paris, and he began working as a cafe pianist in Cat Noir. And that's when he really started his major, you know, the works that we all think of, like, how do you pronounce it? Gymnopede?
Gymnopede.
Ah, thank you. My American ass is just like, the Gymnopades. I'll play a quick clip of the one that everybody knows, which is number 1. He started making those while he was working as a cafe pianist, and I think that is also the point where he really started to get a feel and get, you know, catch the bug for incidental music or his furniture music, because essentially his job at the cafe for years was to sit there and play the piano while everybody else went about their lives. Furniture music is essentially, let me know if I'm off base, but it's kind of hard to explain. It's like incidental music today is thought of like background music or sound effect music, and furniture music was that, but it was supposed to be that to the nth degree. Like, you're supposed to hear this music and it is supposed to be akin to a lamp in the corner of the room that maybe you acknowledge for a second but don't really notice past that point. Something that adds to the atmosphere but isn't really something that draws attention to itself otherwise.
You're totally right. And I think the really interesting thing is that he sort of, like, later in his career, I think he was, like, born to just make film music or something.
In this part of his early life, when he was working in this cafe, we're working towards early/middle of his career, he started... I want to get your take on this, because I saw you put something in the notes about, like, if you actually think that this is how he was, this isn't how he actually was. But there started to be, because of his bohemian lifestyle, there began to be a lot of mystic, quirky things surrounding this man, which has led a lot of historians to believe that he could have had OCD or some adjacent disorder. Personally, obviously we can't diagnose any historical figure with anything because they're dead, but I don't think that he did. And that is because there were rumors, right, that a few of his quirks were only eating white foods. He only ate food that was white. Yeah, he carried a hammer wherever he went. Eating 150 oysters in one sitting. Too. Yeah, no, and I kind of agree with you on that. I think that there are some of these things that are just not true, like the only eating white foods. And the other thing is, like, eating 150 oysters. Okay, me too, because I'm a big back, but also writing a piece with the instruction to repeat 840 times, that doesn't seem like an OCD thing. That just kind of seems like an Eric Satie thing. Yeah. If you pointed to somebody who came along later in the 20th century, like John Cage, and you were like, oh, the fact that he made he made 433 is definitely indicative of X mental disorder. It's like, no, it's not. It was just his style. It was par for the course, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's totally... So, in the notes also, I also don't think that he had OCD or anything like that, if that's the evidence, because part of the reason why Satie was incorporated as, like, one of the sort of figureheads of this avant-garde, like, super irreverent, super sarcastic, and, like, really, like, straight-faced, like, really cynical. It's like there is so Dada basically created memes.
Yes. he did for real.
But like this writing that Satie is doing, where all of these, like, sort of, like, I don't know what you want to call them, like, myths about Satie originate, are part of the contemporary, like, French avant-garde writing scene. So the precursors to the movements that, like, I write about, like Surrealism and Dada, the more well-known avant-garde movements, you started to see things like that appear in the late Victorian through movements like Les Incohérents, were sort of like a precursor to Dada, where they were, like, making, like, hyper absurd posters. I think they had a lot to do with posters, but or, like, really early what could be considered postmodern writing by I think it was Alfred Jarry who wrote Ubu Roy. I do know it's Ubu Roy though. It's like hyper absurdist, like really irreverent, referential, very, like, layers and layers of irony and nonsensical just things. And, like, Satie was very much in this space, and so the writings where he says those things, like everybody likes to point out his hyper specific schedule where he's like, I wake up exactly at 7:01 in the morning, and then I do this, that, and this, and it's like part of these, like, these things were sort of autobiographical in the sense that he's taking things from his own life and then exaggerating it to the 20 millionth degree. And so, I mean, these texts aren't real. They're satire texts. And they're very much within the line of, like, the late 19th to early 20th century hyper absurd, early postmodern literature. Just what was happening at the time in avant-garde writing. And he was very much playing into that.
See, yeah, like, I was, put in a less eloquent and educated ways.
I don't think that was eloquent. That was just a lot of words.
I found it eloquent. I was just about to say they were a bunch of fucking trolls. All of them. They were just trolls. Yeah. They were trolling.
Yeah.
It's like, I think that some of them could be true. I think that, Eric Satie had a certain level of committing to the bit, right? So I do think that if he wrote somewhere, I carry a hammer everywhere, he's probably going to do that. Just because, it's easy. It's committing to the bit. What do you think about the 12 identical suits?
I I don't think he had enough money for that.
Right, and a lot of people are pointing to the fact that it's when he got his small inheritance from the death of a family member, that he used that inheritance to buy the 12 suits. Well, some people say it's 7, and some people say it's 12, which, I mean, in and of itself is a little bit of a red flag.
Yeah.
If we don't know how many suits there were.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I would love to believe that he had multiple identical suits that he would wear every day like a cartoon character, but I just don't know if that holds water.
Dada is often thought of as being like a visual art thing, but they were very much in the literary space, and a lot of the time they would write something and then completely and 100% like commit to the bit,
right?
Like, as you said, like I can't remember what text it was. I had to read it for a course a long time ago, and it said that like a lot of the writers were taking on like Americanisms and stuff like that, and then they changed their names to be Americanized because they were German. And I asked the professor, I was like, they didn't actually change their names to be Americanized versions, right? And he was like, no, they did. Like, they like legally changed their name. I mean, suits cost a lot more money then than they do now.
Velvet corduroy suits, that has to be expensive as hell.
He had like this sort of like foppish persona. Yeah, I think that's just part of that like faux dandy. What do you think it is about like Satie that makes people contemporaneously, because I think at the time people probably would have understood that he's not being serious, because I know a lot of his writings were like published for media. He was like writing these in particular to be published, and I feel like there's something that's like lost in translation. So I'm wondering if you have an idea, like, what do you think it is about his writings in particular, that make people take it seriously?
Well, I mean, I think that that's just exactly it. I think it is very much lost in translation. It's kind of like when you're reading a text message from somebody and you feel like they're using a different attitude, whether they use a period or whether they don't. You know, I think, I mean, from what I've personally read, the more Dadaist, the more surrealist writers, they were good writers. I mean, they were not bad writers. It's just the combination of people reading these texts that don't speak French. They're reading translations of the text. And they're kind of just... It's a lack of research into the movements, because everybody that has told me, yes, this is how Satie was, you know, they didn't have enough time to actually engage with the culture, if that makes sense. And so I think that they would be more inclined to, upon reading it once, believe that he was telling the truth. Because, again, this is the same guy who created furniture music. This is the same guy who created a score called Dried Embryos. You know, obviously you think this guy is going to be kind of a nutcase. And so the more you read about it, I think that it's almost a desire to believe that it's true. Because how funny would that be? Like, at the end of the day, it means that he did his job correctly. Because I think that that's exactly what he wanted.
I'm thinking that it could also be because, according to Roger Shattuck, he did have 2 separate careers, really. Like, he had the first half, and then in the second half, he just, like, kind of denounced everything that he did in the first half. But he worked with Ravel. I think Ravel considered him to be a mentor of some sort. He was also friends with Debussy. He just, like, denounced all of that, and then the second part of his career, he really leaned into the absurdist thing, the absurdist project that he sort of started in the first half. And I think it could be in part because he was really the only one doing that in the musical space. Because until like Cocteau and Poulin came around, there was nobody else like really doing this like really hyper absurd thing So it's more likely to believe that he was sort of weird.
This is the guy who Debussy himself was like, he was kind of ahead of his time. I actually am inclined to believe that Satie is chronically ahead of his time. I think that while he was doing his earlier career stuff, that was kind of more of the precursor to Impressionism in terms of structure anyway. I think that a lot of people thought that his music was provincial and simple. But then as time went on, they had this new appreciation for the simplicity, or the provinciality that he provided. But it was at that point that he was completely over that shit, and he was doing just some off-the-wall bullshit. And nobody liked him then. It's like, damned if I do, damned if I don't, you know? And then after he passed away, obviously, people went back and was like, hey, he might have been onto something, you know? Which, I mean, is kind of funny. And I also think that that is a reason why he is so enigmatic, is because he was chronically ahead of his time. So he was just, through his entire life, just being slept on. I'm gonna fucking butcher this, I'm so sorry. The Gymnopedes didn't get popular until 1911 because Debussy played them. You know? It was one of those situations where somebody kind of needed to put him on for people to even realize who he was. But he was always there. He was always an influence. He was just never in the spotlight.
Yeah. I don't know if he would have ever wanted to be in the spotlight.
Definitely not, no. An observation that, you know, he was chronically slept on, but
yeah,
I think that it's just as valid of an observation that that's probably how he intended things to be. You know, and it could have been a situation where after 1911, when Debussy kind of put him on, he realized that his stuff was getting too popular, so he had to pivot. He had to make himself niche again. No, literally, like, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised.
Funny.
No, yeah.
I love that notion. That reminds me of, I saw I think it was probably on Facebook, some audio clip of Charlie XCX talking about her new album, and she was like, it's not gonna be Brat, it's gonna flop. And I'm okay with that. And I'm like, I feel like...
That's Satie. That's Satie.
That's Satie. Except he never had his Brat mode.
And again, you know, the music that did get popular when it did get popular was mischaracterized as something as it wasn't, because he definitely did not intend to bring about Impressionism. That was not his intention. That's just kind of where Debussy and Ravel took it. Which is also pretty damn funny.
Very well could have been the goal in the first place. Just to be misunderstood. Because it seems like he disagreed, or at least was artistically incompatible with the way that French, or really just art music in general, was functioning at that time.
Now that we've kind of established his motivations, misunderstood motivations, and lack of motivation, I kind of wanted to turn it over to you a little bit in terms of, you know, what was the actual relationship, what was the dynamic between him and Lacey's?
Where do I start? So he was really, like, sort of introduced to this space through his work with Jean Cocteau and Parade in 1917, where, so Parade was a ballet about nothing really, to be honest.
That damn horse.
It's about the horse. It's always about the horse. I'm obsessed with the horse.
Same.
We already know that though, so we don't need to go for that. So essentially, the premise of Parade is that it was a troupe of circus performers trying to get an audience to come in and see their performance. And frequently you would see this in Paris, particularly in the winter. There were like traveling circuses that would come to Paris, and then they would do these sort of like little sideshow acts to give potential audience a chance to see what they might see a better version of, like, if they went into the theater. And so that's the whole premise of Parade, because that's what it was called. And so Pulunk was at the premiere of Parade. This was, like, essentially the catalyst of how, like, Cocteau and Satie and Picasso came to be known by younger artists. Pulunk was introduced to Satie by his first piano teacher, Ricardo Viñes. A group of, like, young composers latched onto this aesthetic, and they latched onto Satie, who, as I mentioned earlier, Cocteau positioned as, like, the pinnacle of, like, the new French aesthetic. The Plessis was really only united as far as they had a name for their group. There was nothing really uniting them in terms of an aesthetic and, like, an appreciation for the premise of Satie-like music. So it was, like, focused on simplicity and anti-bourgeois, you know. I talked about this earlier. But other than that, they didn't really, like, have anything in particular that was really uniting them, other than the name, because all of them were doing completely different things. Pulunk was considered to be the composer that was most in line with the aphorisms that Cocteau wrote in The Cock and the Harlequin, which is why he sort of took a central role within the development of this Satie-based French aesthetic. And so, I mean, that's basically it.
Well, didn't they spend time with him in his apartment quite often?
They did.
Like,
they did,
yeah. Talk a little bit about, like, you know, their personal relationship. Like, what was it, more like a friend or like a mentor or what?
I think he really did just kind of see him as, like, a mentor. I don't know. I'm trying to think of, like, any. I sound like I'm having a stroke, but I'm, like, trying to, like, think of any particular stories in particular from Pulunk's writing, and I just, like, I can't think of any.
No, like, what I would, you know, gather from what I've read is, you know, he was kind of a guy who was an inspiration and, you know, a mentor, but also just something that all of these kids, they would just go to his apartment on the weekends and talk shit.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
He was kind of just, like, he was Unk status.
Totally. Yeah, I think he kind of functioned as sort of, like, I don't know what, like, but I guess, like, the figurative, like, old man neighbor that all the neighborhood kids
Yes!
would just, like, go and talk to. To reiterate, I feel like this space is totally and completely dominated by the aesthetic choices of Cocteau and Pulunk, and, like, the way that Satie kind of functions within it is as a somebody who served a youth. It's like the Mascot.
Remember those memes back in the day where it was like a pair of marionette hands that were being controlled by another pair of marionette hands, and it was like federal government and then Minecraft YouTubers? That's that's and Eric Satie. Yeah. That's like Eric Satie, and then Cocteau is on the top.
Yes. No, Cocteau's controlling anyone and everything. He really was, like, the mastermind.
He was the narrative.
I feel like, yeah, he really did create that narrative, for sure. I don't know if that was really helpful.
No, it was very like, it's interesting how it all fits together, because a lot of people, when they do look at 20th century French music, one, they don't look at it, which I think more people should, and two, they forget Cocteau entirely, because Cocteau wasn't specifically a composer.
He called himself a poet.
Yes.
Everything that he did. And I think the only reason why he wasn't composing music himself is he didn't have musical training. I mean, he didn't, like, formal training, and I mean, Pulunk actually, he did have training from Vignes. And a lot of like his early music, he said, was sort of composed on instinct, which sometimes you can really tell. But
True. Oh my god, me with my compositions.
Yeah, real. I just kind of just put the shit on the page and hope the best. That's why I'm not a composer. That's why I'm a musicist.
Like, I'm saying, dude, don't look at my parallel fifths. Fuck you.
No one really talks about the French avant in general. I have my theories why, and I've put it in my research. But I'm wondering if you have any ideas on why before I start yapping about my writing.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll just give my plain and simple answer before I let you go into your actual answer. I would say, I think personally a lot of people don't talk about French classical music in general. I know that personally in my conservatory studies, I was chronically underlearned on French music. And I think that it also doesn't help that around the time that the French avant-garde was kind of getting its wheels, was around the time when the rest of the world was going to fucking shit. I mean, it was the very problem that the French were trying to fight in the first place, which was the prevalence of Wagnerism and, I guess the titans from all of the other places, like, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Strauss, it was kind of just hard for the French to kind of get their footing. And I think that what they did was so interesting, but nobody talks about France. Again, not to say things weren't hard in France. Objectively, there were things happening that were a lot more polarizing in other places.
Don't ask me to define postmodernism or I'll cry and throw up.
Real shit.
The first real, I guess you could say avant-garde movements, someone's gonna come in the comments and be like, wrong, the first avant-garde movement happened 1592 in blah blah blah.
I'm gonna tell them to shut the fuck up.
But avant-garde in general though, as a concept is really rooted in World War I Europe. Young people were really disillusioned with in particular in the arts, but also at large, because they were being sent to die in a war that was nothing anybody had ever seen before, in a time period in which they were literally just starting their life and they were being sent to the killing fields to die, essentially. Yep. And so Benjamin refers to this, the crisis of experience. Consumerism was just starting to become a major thing, because this was after the major industrial moments. We have a word for that. It's called the Industrial Revolution. Duh.
Hell yeah.
And and so consumerism was still completely entrenched within the way that people were talking about the war and what it means to be nationalist, what it means to be patriotic. It was seen as patriotic as to spend money on consumer goods. This is actually where photo montage, which is one of the data mediums of anti-bourgeois art, came from, where they would just make collages of pictures from print media or actual photographs or literal garbage on the ground. They were found on because they found garbage on the ground and they incorporated it into their art. The way that art had existed previously was no longer compatible with the world that, in particular, these young people were living in. So they would look at these paintings that were Victorian decadence, basically, and looking at these things, seeing this is not representational of any of my lived experiences, and this is representational of the way that the world exists around me. And so that's when these avant-garde movements came about, is because it was a reaction to this completely different world that young people in particular were thrust into. There's a lot more speaking and other stuff going on that actually Satie didn't like. The idea of it was just like too out there for Satie.
Yeah, no, he was just absurd.
I feel like he was really aware of this image he was trying to portray, and he was like really into personal preferences. And I think that part of the disconnect that comes with Satie and the younger members of Les Six, in particular Poulenc and Cocteau, is because of this generational conflict created by World War I. There was a lot of resentment from young people towards the older generations because they were fighting this war that was started by these people.
One of my big research points that I've been absolutely freaking obsessed with right now in terms of the 20th century is how, you know, the things that these young people went through, how they mirror the things we're going through right now. Especially what you say about, you know, the young French, you know, youth and just youth in general, blaming the older generation. I mean, we're all doing that right now. We're also very disillusioned because we realize that at the end of the day, we still have to live and operate in a capitalist hellscape. And so, you know, I feel like for me personally, that's why I was drawn to this specific era of music, because you almost can't help but kind of read it and see the similarities, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, totally, for sure. And I think that's why, like, Dada really, they created shit post aesthetics. Like,
absolutely, you know, and we're doing that shit today.
yeah, totally. Well, I think that's why a lot of, like, young really latched on to that, especially now. Let's circle back. The reason why it's easy to overlook that, though, is because it's deceptively simple. There's a ton of things happening, like, within that musical collage, like the musical photo montage, and it's really easy to, like, overlook the complexity of that because you're really familiar with its contents and you already know what that means. Like, when you watch Prod and you hear, like, the typewriter or, like, the sirens or, like, the gun, it's like, you know what that is. So, but the thinking about the way that it functioned in changing the meaning of the scene and the music isn't something that's necessarily conscious there. And so it's easy to overlook because it's not aggressive in the way that it's asking you to interact with it.
I think that when people see a show that represents ideas rather than, you know, more stable thoughts and themes, they are more likely to believe that maybe it's a half-baked product, or maybe the person that wrote this was just off their rocker, they don't know what they're doing. But when you look even just 3 seconds below the surface, you see what all of these things mean. You know, you see why, and you honestly see the fact that even just as much as Wagner, everything in Parade had a reason to be there. Everything in Parade was methodically planned out and had a purpose. It was just in a different way, in a way that people may not be as used to. And so again, yeah, they're like, oh, not for me. And, you know, personally, you know, a lot of people do the same thing with Webern and his Klangfarben melody. They do the same thing with 12-tone music, shows like Wozzeck, and Moses und Aaron. You know, people look at that and they were like, oh, well, if it's supposed to be so profound, why does it sound like garbage? But they're not willing to give it an honest shake in the same way they'd be willing to give Wagner an honest shake, because Wagner makes sense for the sake of making sense. The end of Satie's life kind of, unfortunately ended pretty unceremoniously. He was heavily into substances, especially alcohol. I mean, pretty much only alcohol. And he died of liver cirrhosis. And, you know, in his final years...
That's really sad.
Oh yeah, no, he died in the hospital of liver cirrhosis, and in the last years of his life, like you said, he had kind of condemned everything that he had done before his later period, and that includes cutting a lot of people off, including, as we had mentioned before, cutting off Poulenc because of his distaste for his new teacher. He actually cut off most of Lacey's before he passed away. And so he kind of died alone in a hospital room of liver cirrhosis. As sad as it is, his life ended as ceremoniously as it carried on. I mean, he was the unwitting... I don't want to say unwitting, because again, he didn't dislike the position he had been given in The Cock and the Harlequin, at least not to my knowledge, but he was unintentionally one of the faces of a movement that he didn't even seek to create. And his life carried on as normal, even though he was being lauded as a figurehead for parts of it. Chronically slept on. Chronically ahead of his time. And kind of passed away as famous as he was in life, which was ultimately not very.
Yeah. That sounds like being a meme page admin.
Fuck yeah, dude. He's literally just like us, for real.